Hello again. This is the second lecture in our series on theories of justice, and we are going to discuss three particular theories of justice. The first being libertarianism, the second being a Rawlsian theory of justice, sometimes thought of as justice as fairness, and then we will conclude by considering a Marxist theory of justice. So let's get right into it, beginning with a libertarian view of justice. And recall that libertarianism really kind of focuses on this notion of egalitarianism or this notion of equality. So for this theory of justice, equality is key, equality is central. And this theory is really kind of rooted in a Lockean political theory of rights. Let me say a couple things real fast about what that means. According to a philosopher named John Locke, our rights are rooted in the fact that we own our own bodies. This is sort of the most fundamental notion of property rights for John Locke. I own my body. I have a right to autonomy. I have a right to self-determination. I can do what I want with my body. Now, for Locke, we do things with our body, right? We sort of mix the labor of what we do with our body with things in the world, and we are the benefactors of the fruits of our labor. So if I go and I build a house, I collect some materials and I put my efforts and my sweat and energy into building this house, well, then I thereby own the house insofar as I own my body. And my body was what I used to produce this house. And so insofar as you have a right to autonomy, a right to self-determination, because you can do what you want with your body, you then thereby own the property that was produced by what you did with your body, sort of mixing your labor with the things in the world. Now, given this kind of Lockean view of rights, we then get a political theory that's rooted in a kind of limited government. Now, proponents of libertarianism tend to favor government that is very limited. It's a kind of an austere way of thinking about government. They would favor government that's primarily for the purpose of defense. And they also tend to be against different government programs like Medicare, or Medicaid, different disability insurance, or food stamps. And this is primarily because, on this view, they tend to be against the redistribution of property, or more specifically, the redistribution of income from the rich to the poor. And again, that's because it's rooted in this fundamental notion that you own your body, you do things with your body, you sort of reap the benefits of the fruit of your labor, and that's your property. Nobody can take that away from you. And as such, this libertarian view of property and of rights and of justice tend to champion certain property rights against many forms of taxation. Again, this is rooted in one's autonomy, one's right to own their body, and thereby owning the property that is produced through the works of their body. And this libertarianism has been expressed by a Harvard philosopher. His name was Robert Nozick, who regarded forced taxation as essentially being equivalent to forced labor. This is a very extreme view of this kind of libertarianism. When you think about taxation as forced labor, where the government comes and takes your property, takes your wealth and your income away from you and redistributes it to the poor for whatever reasons, if you think of that as kind of forced labor, you can see how this would be a very extreme version of this kind of libertarianism. Nonetheless, this was what Robert Nozick believed, and we can kind of use that as a paradigm example to illustrate this view of justice. Now, the next thing that I want to do is try to consider some criticisms of this libertarian view of justice. So some have argued that a purely libertarian system would have very few hospitals. Well, why exactly is that? Well, if you think that there would be fewer government programs to help those people that are poor, those people that are sick, well, then the only people that would be going to a hospital would be those people that could afford the benefits of healthcare. If there weren't the right kind of benefits or resources available for the sick or the elderly, the poor, well, then it might seem as though there would be fewer hospitals. Maybe that would be a good thing. Maybe it wouldn't. Another criticism would be that elderly patients would not really be able to receive the care that they need because they would be in a situation where they lack the money to receive that care. Again, if you think that the only people who would be able to take advantage of this kind of benefits one would receive from healthcare would be the people that have the money to do so, the wherewithal, the means to be able to receive healthcare. Well, given that elderly patients are no longer working, and given that on a libertarian view, the government would not be providing the resources or income to these elderly patients, well, then it seems like one could argue that elderly patients would not receive the care they need because they don't have the money to, they don't have the resources. You might also think that physicians would receive far less money for the services they provide. And again, this is because there would be fewer people receiving those resources. So if you think that physicians should be well paid, then on a purely libertarian view of justice, then you might wonder whether or not physicians would actually even earn the kind of income that we think they should earn. Another way to criticize a view like this is to show that there would be few, if any, regulations on medical practitioners. So if you think that the kind of regulations that are in place are a good thing for medical practitioners, then this would be a criticism for this view. Why? Well, again, on a libertarian view of justice, you just wouldn't have the kind of regulations. The government would not be able to come in and tell the medical practitioners how to practice medicine. And if you think that would be a problem, then that's a criticism for this view. Another way to object to this kind of view is to show that there would be few, if any, regulations on pharmaceutical companies or the sort of drug regulations that we think are a good thing. Generally speaking, people think that the kinds of regulations that are in place in order to make sure that the drugs that people should not be taken are not available, well, if you think those are good regulations, then this is a criticism of a purely libertarian view. Insofar as these regulations on pharmaceutical companies are a good thing, yeah, well, you think that might be a problem for this view. Let me say something to kind of flesh that out a little bit better. Pharmaceutical companies are, just like any other company, a for-profit enterprise. Now, it seems plausible that a pharmaceutical company might put a drug on the market that was not safe because this would raise their profits. If you think that's a problem, and if a libertarian view of justice would allow for this sort of situation, then that looks like a pretty straightforward criticism of a purely libertarian view of justice. Finally, on a purely free market-based economy, there would be no health insurance plans at all. Generally speaking, health insurance companies are there to help pay for the required care that people need. But on this kind of a free market-based or purely libertarian view of justice, it might be the case that everybody would be in a situation where they have to pay for their own health care. Right? So if there was no way in which the government could give resources to the people in need or the sick or the elderly, if the only people that could get any kind of healthcare are the people that could pay for it, well, that seems like it might be a problem. And on this purely free market-based way of viewing healthcare, then nobody would have any healthcare insurance at all.